Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to do something a little interesting because I wanted to run some tests on something. I had seen several players mention that they thought the US Rank 6 ground premiums weren't all that great, and honestly that some of them were kind of weak. And I wanted to put this to the test. I wanted to see if they were legitimately weak, partly because I had recommended some of them in my Abrams video, but also because I wanted to see what data across my games represented versus my personal bias towards actually kind of liking them. So I went on a little bit of a journey, and please follow me and we'll see what the data says. But of course, if we're testing things, the first thing we have to do is come up with a methodology to test them, some way that is at least consistent and repeatable. Now, obviously, I'm not really able to do this across a number of games that's going to create an infallible dataset, but I wanted to at least do it across enough games to get some reasonable results. So what I did was I took the Striker, the XM1, and the M1 KVT, or at least the tech tree equivalents because the Striker and the M1 KVT are essentially identical to their tech tree counterparts, put all three of them in a lineup, and then I went across a total of 18 games with the vehicle spawning in a specific order. Now, what I essentially did was I had 6 different total spawn orders, and each spawn order I would do a total of 3 times. So that's where you get the 18 games. And I wanted to see both, number 1, what was our win rate, number 2, what were the KDs look like with individual vehicles, and of course number 3, did spawning them earlier or later in the match affect their performance. Additionally, however, I noticed that because I was kind of being forced to spawn some vehicles in suboptimal situations, that I would just run through an additional 6 games after that as a different data set and see if I'm just spawning the vehicles when I think it's appropriate, if there's any meaningful difference in their performance. Now, I did have a full lineup, I did have CAS available, however the general rule was I would only spawn CAS if I had already run through all 3 of those spawns and still had the spawn points for it. So there were games where I had the AH6M or the A7D in the matchup, but ultimately I did try to spawn the ground vehicles where possible. So the first thing we're going to look at is the overall win rate. Over the course of the 18 games with these set spawn orders, we had 11 wins, 7 losses, so a total of a 61% win rate. That's pretty good, nothing wrong with that. Over the course of these 6 games where I got to spawn whatever I wanted, I ended up with a 67% win rate, total of 4 wins, 2 losses. Also pretty good, nothing wrong with those win rates. Overall, USA around these battle ratings is reasonably strong, both in terms of ground and air options, so none of these are really a surprise, but just wanted to establish that right off the bat. Now this brings us to the first vehicle in the dataset, and that's the M1120H, the Striker or the Wolfpack. Now the Striker brings up an interesting point because when I was deciding which group I would first spawn, I would generally go with what seemed appropriate for the map. So with the Strikers generally spawned on longer range maps with better positions where I knew I could control sightlines. This resulted in the Striker ending up with a total of an 18 and 11 record, and on first spawns in general, the Striker ended up with 12 and 4. The Striker also ended up with several maps where it was the only vehicle I needed to spawn because it turned out I had really good positions and I could just abuse them. So the Striker is one of those vehicles that ended up being very feast or famine. The second and third spawns, it was weaker, it still wasn't unusable, but the first spawns for the Striker, whenever I could get those really good positions and get those really good sniping spots, the Striker would absolutely dominate. When I took the Striker into the sample size of 6 games where I could just spawn them wherever I want, the Striker ended up with a total KD of about 7 and 2. So it still did incredibly well in that scenario, obviously no surprise there. My general assessment about the Striker is that as a first spawn on big maps with good sightlines, the combination of the M900 shell, the low profile turret, and the good mobility to get into good positions always generally allow the Striker to have really good games or leverage a series of kills into a victory or even a good air spawn. Overall, I think there's really nothing wrong with the Striker. The biggest weakness is spawning at a second or third spawns on urban maps, because the Striker is obviously kind of a chunky vehicle and difficult to maneuver around, although the gun still very much works. The next vehicle was the M1 KVT. The M1 KVT ended up with a total KD in the 18 batch of games at 22 and 13. Now, a big thing about the M1 KVT that I noticed was, especially mid and late game spawns, it was incredibly good. The high mobility and the good rate of fire were very easy to abuse. You could easily get on points, you could capture points, and the gun wasn't great, but it was good enough for every scenario to basically never be at a disadvantage. The incredibly high mobility, especially when in conjunction with the high rate of fire, allowed you to easily capitalize on flanks, or if you get in the middle of the enemy team, you could kind of wreck them. So there were several games where my first spawn was uneventful, but the M1 KVT was able to immediately bring it back with a quick 4 or 5 kills and immediately put the game to bed. Now, when I went into the 6 games where I just played them in whatever order that I felt was appropriate, the M1 KVT ended up with a total of a 7 and 3 KD, so it didn't really drop off that much. It was still positive, it was still around a 2 to 1 plus or minus, and overall just really helped me like leverage good positioning into good victories. It's a vehicle that you want good map awareness, you want to know where you want to go on the map, but if you do, the vehicle will do everything you need it to do. It has absolutely no problem, and in terms of durability, not anything special, but it does often survive hits. Now, the XM1 is obviously the elephant in the room because even though it is relatively light and fast, it's also significantly over BR'd because I was taking it into 10.3 matchups. It ended up with a 9 and 11. However, if I excluded the first spawns, which I did the math on because first spawning it isn't great, you would mostly use it as a backup as BR anyway, it went 6 and 5, so still very acceptable. Overall, while the XM1 is not really suitable for these battle ratings, it's not completely helpless either and can consistently take on opponents. And this is where we also noticed a sharp increase when we took it into the 6th batch of games where it went 5 and 3. So it went from negative or barely positive, depending on how you counted it, to actually pretty consistently positive. As a late game spawn, the XM1 was consistently very useful to the point where it's not the best vehicle in the world, but as a late game backup, the high mobility and the shell is still generally functional, allows it to still be a very useful vehicle. This of course does kind of bring up the tangential discussion of things like air spawns. So the A7, I actually had several pretty decent games in it after the main spawns were depleted. Had one where I got 4 kills. The MH6 Little Bird, actually kind of hard to contest in the air, had several games with that where they were very successful. Having good cast options gives you good options for late game when you know the enemy may not have enough anti-air up, or when you're in a position where the opponents are thin enough on the ground that you can single out and take out the handful of enemies that are actually making plays. So having good cast options, it's not necessary, but it does present you with a fairly usable option. I also had the Lav AD in the lineup just in case I needed it, but I didn't end up needing it. Overall, I think the American 10.3 lineup on the whole is pretty good, and there's a lot around these premiums to make them powerful, even when the premiums themselves might be at a disadvantage based on the map or the battle rating you're playing. Overall, I will say that the American premiums at rank 6, I gained a pretty good appreciation for why they might not be the most well-liked vehicles. The XM1 doesn't have the best shell, neither does the M1 KVT. The Striker has a really good shell, but can be awkward in certain situations. So despite the power level of the vehicles being pretty respectable and me having consistently good games with them, I did find that, especially if you were a less experienced player or you didn't have a lineup to back them up, so you're just doing one and dones, the vehicles could feel a lot more limiting. For example, if all you had was a Striker and you're forced to take it on close range urban maps, you're probably going to have less appreciation than if you have other vehicles that can take fights on those maps and you're using the Striker on longer range maps where it can really excel. And this is one of those things about War Thunder, is the game is balanced around the concept of lineups and having multiple spawns for a player. So anytime you're not doing it, you have to understand that you're going to be coming into the fight with a disadvantage. Your win rate is going to struggle, and additionally, individual vehicle characteristics are going to struggle because you're using them for things that they're not necessarily ideally suited for. Personally, I'm pretty happy with the American Rank 6 premiums. I think they're all good. I could easily recommend picking any of them up if you want to grind out the American tech tree, especially the Wolfpack now that it has M900 instead of relying on the slightly worse shell, as it's at this point essentially identical to the tech tree version. Overall, I like them. I think they're very functional, but I could definitely see how somebody might struggle with them, especially if they weren't that experienced at this battle rating. But what do you think? Do you like them? Do you think they're particularly good? Let me know down in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you had fun watching, and I do hope that you like and subscribe if you did. Have a great day, everybody.